everybody. Welcome to the Coffee Chat. I'm Andy Bozarth, Director of Outreach and Advocacy for AARP Kansas, and we're really glad you joined us today. We have a great show for you. We're joined by Stanley Adams and Melinda Stanley. Lots of Stanleys on the screen today. And they are from the Department of Commerce, and they work with broadband access and expansion in Kansas. So welcome, Melinda and Stanley.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for taking time. I know you're both very busy, and I appreciate you coming onto the show to help us learn about all of the challenges and the benefits of broadband access in Kansas. Can you tell me a little bit about how the Department of Commerce fits into broadband in the state?
Sure. Let me start by, thank you again. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all today. The Office of Broadband Development was established by Governor Kelly last year with a specific charter to improve broadband access and connectivity all across the state. A lot of folks don't necessarily know that there is a problem. As I like to say, everyone doesn't have access to the internet. And then there's an even larger number of people who have access that's not adequate for today's needs. It has a lot to do with legacy I can talk about if you like. But so it started out in the Commerce Department, and I've been working on this broadband advocacy work probably the better part of 10 years now. It started in the Department of Commerce years ago, just because the internet was clearly going to be an e-commerce issue and economic development, economic growth issue, or a tool, if you will. And that's obviously evolved into becoming something that's present in every facet of our lives for the most part. So it's in fact, so that's the answer to the question. I don't want to get long-winded on you, but yeah.
That's great information. And access to broadband is really important to people over the age of 50 for issues like medical appointments that people can now do around telehealth, and also just for keeping in contact with their family members. So in rural areas, is there more of an issue in a rural area than there is in an urban area? Or how does that balance?
Great question. So the answer is both. It's acute in rural areas for specific reasons. In rural areas, the problem is, let me back up. The accessibility issue for seniors are present in both rural and non-rural areas. The reasons for the issues are somewhat different sometimes, right? So in the rural areas, there's a little bit more of an infrastructure question, right? Is there actual infrastructure to make the connectivity happen in the first place? And we're doing some things to mitigate that. But in both rural and non-rural areas, there's a constructive access, adoption, digital literacy, digital equity components that affect all of our communities in the state.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. And to find out that I think people think that cities and urban areas have no problems with access, and that maybe rural areas have more problems, but there is an issue everywhere, it sounds like.
Right, there really is. And that's why it's a digital, when you think about the digital divide, it doesn't have a barrier between rural and non-rural areas. So yeah, there are issues. There are even infrastructure issues in some of the more urban, more populated areas. But like I said, that issue is definitely more acute and persistent in the rural areas.
Wow.
In some of the rural areas.
Right. And what is your department doing to help people access broadband?
Well, funny you should ask. We actually are doing quite a few things. As I mentioned, the governor just signed an executive order. It's a pretty heavy mandate for us to do a lot of things. All of the things which we're talking about here. And I can give you a little bit of a teaser on some of them. I'll let Melinda tell you about the Broadband Acceleration Grant, but let me just kind of tell you a little bit about what we have just recently been working on. If that's helpful. So in order to, particularly with respect to some of the physical infrastructure access issues, and in light of the pandemic, we had a total of $60 million allocated to our office late last year to help improve build out in our state. There was a $10 million fund that individuals, well, actually, how did that work? That went to support residential low-income households to get on the internet if they couldn't afford it for a temporary period of time. And then there was a $50 million, what we call SURGE, Connectivity Emergency Response Grant Program, that allowed communities to partner with service providers or vendors to actually build out the network where it was not presently available. And we had over 60 projects across the state that made a lot of improvement in its, most of those areas were in rural areas. So that's one piece. And then simultaneously, prior to the pandemic, we were already planning. So it's kind of out of sequence, but prior to the pandemic, we were already planning to do the first state-funded infrastructure grant program. So that Connectivity Emergency Response Grant Program I talked about, that was actually the $50 million and $10 million for federal dollars from the CARES Act. And the Governor's Spark Committee gave us that allocation to drive broadband improvements. There's another investment that the governor had made prior to the pandemic hitting. We were already planning a 10-year, $85 million investment in broadband infrastructure that would be, for the first 3 years, $5 million a year, and then $10 million a year for the remaining 7 years. Again, focusing on the infrastructure side of the equation. And that's what actually Melinda joined the team, just so that we could have someone driving the bus on it, if you will. So Melinda, you want to tell them a little bit more about the Broadband Acceleration Grant?
Yes, absolutely, you bet. So the Acceleration Grant Program, we are in the first round, actually, of awarding, as Stanley mentioned, $5 million. The program requires another $5 million in match. So although when we think of scratching the surface with $5 million, it's actually equating to a $10 million investment for this first round, which, as Stanley mentioned, we are also getting to the finish line as far as awarding those, which we anticipate an announcement tomorrow on the recipients of that $5 million worth of grant awards. We really focused on high need areas, those areas that are unserved in the state, folks that lack quality access to broadband services, unreliable services. You'll see a mix of highly rural areas, some areas that may have wireless access in a community, but yet with tree coverage, Kansas winds, and a lot of other challenges, the service is unreliable. And so it makes all those things that we do from day to day, whether it's remote learning or remote work. You mentioned telehealth earlier, Andy. Some of those day-to-day life, the quality of life things that we want to do makes those really challenging in some of these areas. So we're looking forward to solving the problem in, I think it's 19 communities in the state and 14 grants that will be awarded tomorrow. So
wow, that is really exciting news. And I promised Melinda and Stanley that we would share the link on our Facebook page after the announcements are made, so you can see who the winners of those grants are. It's really exciting. to hear that there are so many communities that are going to be able to improve their access to broadband, and it will definitely improve their entire community. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Andy Bozarth, Director of Outreach and Advocacy for AARP Kansas, and I'm joined by Melinda Stanley and Stanley Adams from the Department of Commerce, and we're discussing broadband expansion in Kansas. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the chat box, and I'm sure Melinda and Stanley will be happy to answer your questions. And we do have one question, and that is, what portion of rural Kansas do you estimate has limited or no broadband access?
Wow, such a good question. So there are multiple answers to that question. So it depends on what data source you use. I think it's fair to say easily a third.
Wow. So a third of Kansas has no access.
Well, let's talk about what this gets to be a little bit of a tricky thing, and I don't want to get you into the weeds. But here's what's important. As I like to say, there's broadband and then there's broadband, right? So it's a little technical, but basically there are definitions for what constitutes broadband services. So if you're trying to do remote learning, if you're trying to do remote education, if you're trying to work from home, right? If you've got a bunch of folks on the internet at the same time, you're going to notice a difference in your internet connectivity. It's going to slow up. It's going to freeze. You'll have issues. That has to do with what type of speeds you have. They refer to download speed and upload speed. For most of us, most of the things that we typically do have a lot to do with the download speed. So I only mention that so that I can explain. If you go by the minimally adequate definition of broadband, which is defined by the FCC as 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. When I say 25.3, that's what I'm referring to. So anything less than 25.3 is not considered broadband, right? And to be honest, even at 25.3, that's not that great if you've got multiple people on the internet at the same time at your home, right? But nonetheless, 25.3 is the minimum number. If you've heard of gig, some people may have heard of gigabit. So that's 1,000 megabits versus the 25, right? So that's kind of, a gig is 1,000 meg. So that's kind of the order of magnitude difference. Like where I live, I have options where I can get gig service. And there are areas in the state where you cannot get 25.3 or better. That's the third, if you will. A third of Kansas can't get that minimally adequate amount, roughly. Again, it does. The numbers move around depending on how you count different things, but I think generally that's a fair take. And that's honestly, Andy, that's a big part of why my office exists, because there are reasons those areas tend to not have service over time. And there's a lot of funding that goes in at the federal level to try to offset it. But over the years, it's just continuing to be a problem, which is why, and Kansas is not unique on this at all. But all of the states are setting up offices similar to mine to try to do something about it. So it's like I said. So the question is really a good one. It's actually a larger number than you would think.
That is a large number. When you think about a third of the population not having access, or a third of the state not having access, that's a lot of people.
Third of rural communities.
Third of rural communities, I'm sorry.
Right.
That's a lot of people who don't have access to remote learning, remote work, telehealth.
Right.
I mean, buying groceries online. You can do pretty much anything online today. And that's, it's almost become a necessity for people to have broadband access in order to live their lives today. And so that's a lot of people who don't have access to that. We do have another question in the chat. That is, when will telehealth services be available in most areas of Kansas?
Well, I don't know. So I don't know if I'm the right person to answer the question. It's more of the telehealth services are important and connectivity is required to make it work. So it's really the healthcare providers that offer those services, right? over the internet. And the number of services that are being offered in telehealth and telemedicine are definitely increasing, as I'm sure all of your audience is probably experiencing, because doctor's offices, in the case of my parents, their doctor's offices said, no, do not come to our office under any circumstance unless we tell you to. So it's on the internet, on the phone, right? If you don't have internet connectivity, you old-fashioned doing it over the phone, but that limits the number of things you can do. So I think the answer to the question, it depends on your doctor, your healthcare provider, and what type of services they provide. And I think the reason it's a really important question, Melinda, do you agree? It's an important question now because so many applications in healthcare are starting to do to deliver services via the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. And the robust infrastructure is important for that to be a quality service and interactive, as Stanley mentioned. So our role would be to help make sure that infrastructure exists so those kinds of services can happen. So.
Definitely. And you're doing a lot of good work in Kansas around broadband expansion. How do we compare to other states?
Well, that's a good question too. The data, you'll hear a consistent theme. Good data is hard to come by because there are so many different ways to measure all of these. We are very similarly situated to other states generally. One of the things that I notice is, our rural issues in particular are not unique to Kansas. I'm a native of Michigan. Michigan has plenty of rural areas too, and they have the same set of issues that we have here. Even though it's a highly industrial state, obviously with the Motor City and all that, but it's the same set of serious population centers, and then the sparsely populated outlying parts of the states. Very common. So we are fairly consistent in many respects. We're behind in some material respects, but generally, I view this subject generally, the broadband connectivity, as an opportunity for our state to become a leader rather than a follower. Because even though we're landlocked, the internet, in essence, is the great equalizer, right? You just don't need geographic presence in order to be to do business, to do all of the things we're talking about. So I think having robust connectivity for all of our state gives us an advantage to some of the many other states if we do it right.
That's a really good point. Now, does connectivity and broadband affect how many businesses come into Kansas?
Right. So the way to think about it is, businesses. It's to the point now where if a business is looking to relocate, and this could be small or large business, right? Not having internet access, and by which we mean robust internet access, not having it is a non-starter. You're just off the list, right? It's similar to that would be akin to saying there's no electricity in that community, or that there's no water and sewage in that community. It is that basic. So from an economic development and attracting businesses perspective, our state does have a lot to be proud of, because we have a lot of communities that have really good broadband. So it's just that if you don't have it, you're probably not attracting businesses. You're not going to be competitive, because even if your job doesn't require it, your employees are going to want to have it, right? So therefore, your employees aren't going to want to live there. So it's a little bit of it's I don't know I can't overstate it. It affects every part of our lives to the point where you can't watch a newscast or see something that you're doing with. For more information, go to www, right? For whatever it is, applying for a job, finding out about COVID, vaccines, where to go. It's a basic necessity for us nowadays.
Definitely.
And I would add that it helps keep our existing business, and think of farmers and ranchers. They have to remain viable, right? So it also is core to their continuing and their livelihood to make sure that broadband is available, to make sure that our Kansas communities and those that do business within the state, no matter where we are able to conduct business, because it's so core to that.
Definitely. Thank you, guys. I do want to say that AARP does support the expansion of broadband, and we are advocating for that for a committee to oversee broadband expansion in Kansas. So if you're interested in learning more about AARP advocacy efforts around broadband expansion in Kansas, please go to www.aarp.org/KS, and you'll be able to access our advocacy platform that we're working on this year. And we do have a couple questions, a couple more. Are there rural areas where, due to a lack of infrastructure, towers or service providers, no internet access is available at all?
Are you asking, are there areas where there is no access at all? Yes, there are.
In Kansas?
Yes.
Wow. That's very disturbing, actually.
Yeah, it's and again, a little bit of definitional, right? So there's no question. Some of the most sparsely populated areas, it's the one saving grace that happens most often, but even then, and your own user experience will attest to this. Cell phone coverage typically substitutes as internet access in some of those areas, right?
Right.
So, and when we talk about broadband, we are generally not talking about cell phone service,
right,
which cell towers can be used for internet, but the current state, it's getting to the point where it is a good. Well, that's only true if you're in a populated area. In the low populated areas, there are definitely areas that are gapped. It's a public safety issue as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, we do see the mobile hotspot as the last resort.
Right.
And as Stanley mentioned, it is rural areas, but it's also some suburban fringe areas where, there may be low-lying areas, and for whatever reason, you may be at the end of an area or right past an area that has fiber coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get into Kansas winds and other unreliable causations, if you will, of why you don't have solid access, and even the mobile hotspots and cell coverage is bad in some of those areas. It would be, not quite the same if Kansas were as flat as some people think, but this is obviously not a flat state.
Yeah.
So it's because of the terrain and some of those challenges that make it a little more challenging to make sure that everyone has coverage.
You brought up something real interesting, the hotspot concept. And hotspots are a mobile device that allows you to have access to the internet. And AARP offers a community challenge grant that is open right now. And 2 years ago, the city of Wichita utilized that grant to purchase hotspots that they could loan out to people from their community centers. And so people who did not have access to broadband at home through a provider on an ongoing basis were able to rent those out. So that's something. Communities are becoming very creative in how they're getting broadband access to their people. So again, if you're interested in, if you're a part of a community that's interested in looking at hotspots, please look at the AARP Community Challenge Grant that is open until April, and see if there's a way that you can, come up with an idea around hotspots. It was a very successful program in Wichita. We are getting close to the end of our time. So are there any words of encouragement or things that you would like to tell people on the call before we close it out?
Well, I do want to add one thing and turn it over to Melinda, but I think, all of the above is right on point. Going forward, we are focusing on both the infrastructure, physical asset piece of the equation, as well as the utilization, adoption, digital equity part of the equation, constructive access. I'm very optimistic that additional funding is about to become available for us. If you all follow the news, there's it's weird to say $1 trillion, but there's a $1.9 trillion bill that the Congress is set to pass, I think, this week. Included in that bill is substantial funding for each state to improve its broadband infrastructure and access. So I am, if you're interested in knowing more about funding opportunities, I would encourage you to kind of stay tuned. You can find out what we're doing by going to our website. If you have internet, because here I go with my www. kansascommerce.gov/broadband is how to find the Office of Broadband Development. And that's where we typically put our latest and greatest information. I do tweet sometimes. I'm not a reliable tweeter, but I do tweet stuff like that as well. And then there's, we will do a lot of outreach and awareness for people once we find out the details of these funding opportunities. We anticipate in the next year we'll also be be in a position to provide technical assistance to local communities as well. It's one of those things right now where we are requested to come and visit with communities on how they can configure themselves to take advantage of some of these funding opportunities, for example. Mm-hmm. But this is the entire team right here, the Stanley and Stanley team. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I that's exactly right. While we're 4 months old, 5 months old at the Office of Broadband Development, and this is an issue that we have invested, both Stanley and I, probably over 25 years in collectively. And we know it's a problem that in Kansas we have to solve as we look at public and private partnership and having, Kansans come to the table and help us understand, hey, I lack broadband access over here. We get calls every week from folks that are in that gap. And those are the situations that we hope to solve collectively. We would encourage several things. One is, if you're in an area that lacks access, if you don't have access at home, we would highly encourage you to reach out to your public governing bodies to make sure that your local officials, your local leaders know that you're in the gap and that you need some help. And that collectively, then we can work with the communities to help try to solve those issues, because it ranges from wide open space to suburban fringe. So
that's so great. Thank you both so much for joining me today. This has been fabulous information that everybody needs to hear. And you've made it very understandable for us. And to those of you joining on the call, please come back and see me next week, same time, same place, when we'll be talking to House Rent Records about a program that they have bringing urban and rural youth together around music. So thank you very much, and y'all have a great day.